Okay, thank you very much. We are here to discuss with Jonathan Franzen about his book, What If We Stop Pretending, but also his position, his thoughts. We have lots of questions, but of course, we probably can present to him just a few questions. So first of all, thank you for your presence today. It's an honor and it's a privilege to have you here. Jonathan Franzen is, as you know, is a U.S. novelist, author of several books, including corrections or the corrections, Freedom, the recently published, recently means last year, Crossroads, and other works as nonfiction. By the way, he also has an activity as a translator. This is what I discovered from German, right?
Correct.
In September 2019, he published an essay, a short paper in a quite prestigious journal, which is called The New Yorker, entitled, and this is the book, What If We Stop Pretending? To which, by the way, the publisher's edition gave a scathing subtitle. They say, the climate crisis is here, our chance to stop it has come and gone, but this doesn't have to mean the world is ending. This is the book, and you can find the book through Amazon or whatever. Jonathan, my first question has an introduction, which is, as I said before, slightly longer than the other question, but I think I need to put the reality check in a broader context. So please allow me this, let's say, few lines of presentation, which starts from a very unusual perspective, at least, because I came recently across to an exchange of letters between 1930 and 1932 between Sigmund Freud and Albert Einstein. They were not exactly friends, by the way. Also, they have 20 years of difference, so there was. They took their time, they exchanged letters, etc. They discussed different things. First of all, the future of the League of Nations that I remember, not to you, but to the rest of people, which was the institution which was think in order to prevent after the First World War, in order to prevent the Second World War, and of course it didn't work. But also they were discussing a lot about Nazism, which was, say, knocking on the door in the 30s. At that time, by the way, they were already, say, superstar. In the sense that Freud won the Nobel Prize in 1921, so was already well known. Freud was well known, but the poor was nominated 32 times for Nobel of Medicine and never awarded. As I don't know, expected or unexpected conclusion of the story of this long epistolary was the independent decision of both to leave the country. As we know, Einstein went to the US, playing, by the way, no role despite a number of requests to the Manhattan Project, also because he received the security clearance due his well-known pacifism activity, and died in Princeton in 1953. Freud moved to London and is buried in Hampstead, very nice place to visit. And by the way, ironically died 23 days after the beginning of the war, so in September 1939. Among other issues, what is interesting from our perspective is that they discuss a lot between the relation between mythology and storytelling, arguing that in Greek times the intellectual were few differences among intellectuals in the sense that someone who have been an artist, a musician, a philosopher, but also at the same time a writer of a sculpture. And as you know, in this country, we have a shining example of artist, scientist. Leonardo da Vinci, for example, as we know, is universally recognized as both an artist and a scientist. However, in a specific time, which is probably, science has become probably too specialistic to allow to have a foot in both camps. And so, in short, after Newton and Leibniz, to keep a long story short, generally speaking, if you are a writer, you are not a scientist. However, some time ago, Jonathan Franzen emerged, writing on issues I've been dealing for the last 30 years. So as a half-serious consideration, I need clarification since I'm, say, getting confused because I have lost my role on this planet. If a writer starts writing about things I've been writing in the last 30 years. So my first question, half-serious question, no, the question is serious, so the consideration were half-serious, is why should, let's say, an extremely successful writer like you decide to talk about climate change, and how do, in your view, literature and science overlap to some extent in the shared and common responsibility for this continuous reality check between science and writing?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today, and thank you to all the people I cannot see but who I'm told are here. I appreciate your taking your time on a Wednesday night, chilly Wednesday night in Italy to tune in. I'll get a little bit into how I came to write about things outside the novel, but I would first immediately say that climate science is not like certain other forms of science, in that it has an activist role to play in society, and from the beginning, going back to even the 80s, scientists were thrust into the role of political activism, raising the alarm about what we were doing to the atmosphere. And that has continued to be the case. Many of the leading voices among climate activists are scientists. And because, so I would begin by saying that the creep out of one's specialty actually began from the scientist side. They stepped out into the public, and once you step out into the public, you need to consider what you're saying from a rhetorical perspective, not from a scientific perspective. And some decades later, for reasons I'll explain, I came along and stepped into that arena myself, except from the art side, because when you are discussing an issue in the public space, how you frame the issue, how you talk about the issue, the language you use, the rhetoric you use, the rhetorical approach you choose, that's not a specialty question. That's of concern to all of us. I particularly come to this as somebody who wanted to be a scientist when I grew up. I had a laboratory at my basement. I went to college anticipating that I would major in physics or maybe astronomy. And even though my head was turned by literature and I became a literature major and set out to be a novelist, I wrote my first novel while working for 5 years in a geophysics laboratory at Harvard. That's how I paid my bills as a novelist. I looked at seismograms for 20 hours a week and snipped out noise from the signal in seismograms. That was pretty much my job. It was something that you didn't have to have a PhD to do. And I've always been interested in science. I continue to read a lot about it. And I just have to say that because I have this background, even as science has become more specialized, you know, I know what a standard deviation is. I know I have a which may figure in some subsequent questions what a standard deviation is and what a probability distribution looks like. I followed physics all the way up through quantum physics. I understand the chemistry. And the thing is, so now I don't have to study it because I just kind of keep up on what's even in the New York Times in their science section. And yet that's mostly in a passive way. What got me actively involved in writing about climate was that I fell in love with birds, became a bird watcher, and quickly realized that birds are in trouble. The natural world is in trouble. So I got very involved in conservation, particularly the conservation of birds. But I spent a lot of time, I continue to spend a lot of time with people who are doing conservation. And it was in response to their frustration with the direction that the environmental movement has taken that I wrote for the first time about the way we are talking about climate and the way the climate problem has to some extent deformed our priorities in terms of the natural world. And so I think I guess I really have just written maybe 3 essays about climate. And it was in the last one, What If We Stop Pretending, which was the shortest one, that I realized it's not just about drawing attention away from the problem of the natural world that we have, that the climate activism is having such a huge effect. It's drawing attention away from all sorts of things. And those things that attention is being drawn away from are also very important, and in fact will become more important if we fail, as we fail, to rein in the global mean temperature. So that's how I came there, and that's why I came there, and that's why I also felt it was appropriate to step outside my specialty.
No, I agree. Of course, having read the book several times, I can say that I've changed my opinion about the book, let's say, in a positive way. So the first reaction, to be honest, was to say, what the hell is that? Then I react in a different way. Then at the end, I'm your fan to some extent. Then I will explain why. But beside all the different perspectives we may have, I'm talking about perspective, not differences, but perspective in science and literature. My simple question, or one simple question, is, which is a question that also comes from my experience, how difficult it is to talk and to write about climate change. By the way, writing is a crucial issue per se. As Stephen King wrote, writing is time-consuming, frustrating, and miserable. So just to give you the idea of how tough that kind of job can be. So this question is just might sound like a personal question. Is we understand that you spend much time doing specific research, so you are not writing, out of the blue. You know what are you doing. So the question is, can you just for me, for example, because everyone has its own way, can you briefly describe a typical day in a typical week you dedicated to writing? So are you, I say, because they are what I say 9 to 5 writer, so very, or do you prefer, say, follow your instincts, stream of consciousness, starting in writing, how when you feel is the right time to write? So what is your method, if we say, in writing?
My method is to go to the office every day, first thing in the morning. And my job is writing, but I don't write very often. I write in spurts or bursts. So much of what I'm doing on a typical day, if you asked about a typical day, statistically on a typical day, I'm not doing any writing. But I'm trying to get to the point of being
thinking.
Right.
It looks it seems that you are not doing, you are thinking.
I'm thinking, yeah, exactly. And you know, what I believe I am best at is writing novels. And it is simply the case that with each of my novels, there has been a period of 2 to 7 years where I've been struggling to figure out what the story is I'm telling and how to tell it. And then will come a very happy 1.5 or 2 years where I'm actually writing the book. Those are the best years of my life. Those are the best months of my life, the best days of my life when I'm actually writing. But there are many ways to go wrong with a piece of writing, especially a novel. Most novels aren't very good. If you want to write a good novel, you really have to give a lot of thought to how to do it. And that is a combination of ideas, but ideas are cheap. It's a matter of technique. How do you go about telling a story? But the biggest part of it for me is connecting with something that I believe in and that I feel I must write. In other words, I need to examine myself, in a way, psychoanalyze myself, trying to figure out what it is that constitutes hot material, something that I can write with conviction and passion and energy about. And that's harder than you might think. And it gets even harder as you get older because you've already used most of the hot material. So there's a lot of downtime. I would say that with an essay, typically my essays begin from a position of anger. I'm angry about something. I'm angry about an injustice. I think people are talking about a topic in the wrong way. I think I think people aren't paying enough attention to something that I think is very important. It makes me angry. And the next thing I feel is, okay, I'm angry. I shouldn't be writing because it's bad to be an angry writer. Do I dare get into this thing that is making me angry? So much of the psychological work of getting to the point of writing an essay is working up the courage to actually get into something that makes me angry.
Mm-hmm. So it's like you take your time to eat ideas, to prepare to digest ideas, and then when you are ready to write. So as if you are reading and thinking for months, and at a certain point you decided to take the pen.
Yeah, typically with an essay, the reason people aren't talking about something that I think they should be talking about is that they're afraid of the consequences of talking about it.
Yeah.
And it is, I consider it my job to try to talk about things that people are afraid to talk about. Yeah. That's, but of course I'm afraid too. And so that's the struggle.
Yeah. An exciting proposal from your book, and I'm quoting just to be sure, that you suggest to fight smaller, more local battles, that you have some realistic hope winning. So my question is, do you really think that we should, let's say, diversify the range of actions that we need to take? Or, for example, do you believe that the preservation of biodiversity as well as policy of adaptation should be give priority over mitigation actions? Then on adaptation and mitigation, I have another question for you. I think, and this is my question in this, I think that we are spending, let's say, policymakers, governments don't like adaptation instead of mitigation, because adaptation, in my view, is a proof of the incumbent failure. Our governments fail in mitigation, and so they go for adaptation. And the problem is that, and this is the reason why, even if, as you know, IPCC devoted one book on adaptation and another one on mitigation, I think that the way the policymakers are approaching this issue are different, in the sense that adaptation, again, it's something that is proving that you didn't make your job properly. What is your opinion about mitigation adaptation? Then I have another question on this story, but go ahead.
I'm sure that's true. And I think that's part of the gulf between policymakers and the general public. I think in general, the average citizen recognizes, oh, this is not going well, and may experience some frustration that we continue to behave as if the struggle is going pretty well and we can prevail. And the person who's threatened by forest fires or by flooding says, yeah, okay, but in the meantime, we're getting more flooding and more fires. Why are you continuing to talk about the year 2035 or the year 2050, zero carbon emissions by 2050? You know, that doesn't help me now. And it's not going to help me in 2024 when the next fire or flood comes along. So there is this, there is a kind of mythology, and it's interesting to hear you use the word mythology as something Freud and Einstein were talking about. There was this mythology that developed starting in the 90s in the climate science community, which was also the climate activist community. There's very broad overlap between those two communities. And it was, if we can just put the brakes on forced heating of the atmosphere, we can make this whole problem go away. And it's hard to let go of that dream. So yes, I think there's a political cost to be paid if you admit, okay, we failed. But I think there's also, and I say this as a humanist, I think there is, I think it's very hard to let go of that dream just as an emotional issue. And I can tell that there's a lot of emotion there from the hostility that my writing has generated within that climate activist community. It's, how dare you say that? This is our cherished dream. We're not letting go of that dream.
Mm-hmm. On this point, the point of adaptation, I have a very, let's say, very tough question, because I was reluctant, because it seems to me difficult to digest, but I put in anyway. I feel probably, I think that adaptation is another signal of infinite human arrogance, in the sense, a sort man has permanently moved for, let's say, environmental reasons. When we were in Africa, Ethiopia, our grandmother, Lucy, moved, not because he was interested in Sweden, but just because he had basically eaten everything they could, and they have basically cut down all different plants. Now, we want to stay where we were born and raised. We are less reluctant to move. No, we are not less reluctant. We don't want to move. Adaptation is another, let's say, hubris, let's say, in the ancient Greek tragedy. We don't want to move. And I think even if, of course, there are discussions about putting dams in Manhattan in order to, because we want to stay in Manhattan even if we made a mess. And so people don't want to move. Adaptation is another way to say we don't want to move. I'm pushing too much.
You know, I think that the word arrogant could also be applied to the idea that we can, that we really do have the power to make rational decisions and essentially engineer the atmosphere so that we don't have to adapt. Adaptation seems like, to me, like a more humble position. And yes, it would be good to preserve Manhattan because it's whatever $1 trillion of real estate there. There's a good economic argument for not having to relocate the city of Manhattan or the city of New York to someplace 100 miles inland. I mean, that's that. But I actually think that in an almost moral way, to recognize that actions have consequences. We have taken the action of pumping however many gigatons of carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere, and we are going to accept that we have done this and that we are going to have to make some changes. So I don't, maybe in the circles you move in, adaptation has the connotation of nothing has to change. I think a lot has to change, clearly. As parts of the planet become uninhabitable, something will have to change. You can't stay there. Just, you know, you have to move from Ethiopia to Sweden. That's true. Yeah.
But that's called environmental refugees, no? So people that are forced to move due to climate change.
Absolutely.
But, you know, but there is also a sort of, let's say, Western type of. So if you know, olive oils are not in Puglia, but they are moving to Lombardy, and the wine will be produced in the UK. Does it change a lot to us? No. So we want wine in Italy. Probably, I mean, the wine, there will be, as you said, some movements that have been decided by us, by our behavior, that probably is too late to stop.
Yeah, I mean, to me, adaptation is, that kind of thing is relatively straightforward. You can no longer grow X crop in Y place. You're going to have to find a new place to grow it. That's easy compared to, here is a country in sub-Saharan Africa which will be 100% uninhabitable in 50 years. This is a geopolitical issue because that's a large population that needs to go somewhere. It would pay to be thinking hard now about just what the stance of other countries is going to be with respect to the country that is no longer inhabitable. And unfortunately, what we're seeing now is, it is a belief of mine. It's only a belief. It cannot be proved, but it's a belief of mine that part of the rise in populist, authoritarian, nationalist governments worldwide is a response to that not so distant threat. You are going to defend your borders and you're going to keep people out. So that's a kind of adaptation, I suppose. Build a wall, stop immigrants from Africa coming into Europe. And the question is, well, yeah, one way or another, we will be making adaptations, but is this the most humane? Is this the most correct, ethically correct way to respond to the problem, to become military powers and defend our homeland? Maybe not. So
no, yeah, you're right. But you know, in this country, for example, we had about 200,000 immigrants per year. Okay, if they were, say, in 10 years' time, they become 4 million. We need to adapt our society for sure. Right. So, to put it another way, if there is such a huge movements from Africa as we know, instead of receiving very badly, that's my consideration, 200,000 people in Italy, the number of people will be multiplied by 6, 7, or 10 times. And that, of course, will pose a question, which is a political question, which is a social question, so it's a problem for all society. And definitely, this is an adaptation that has been not decided, but we will have to decide our form of adaptation because, you know, instead of 200,000, there will be 4 million. So yes, there will be another way. That definitely not. We cannot have a border of walls. We cannot think to react building walls in this respect. We need to readapt our society. I totally agree with you.
Yeah, and I think it's good to be talking about those things now.
Instead of
when, yes, because
you're right.
I have never said we should not continue our strong efforts to mitigate. I'm in favor of mitigation.
Oh, yes.
I have only 2 points to make about mitigation. One is it will not result in staying beneath 2 degrees Celsius of global warming. And 2, because it won't, because it is in that sense going to fail, it should probably be done in a judicious way, which is to say, to give an example, not every site that could have a wind farm necessarily should have a wind farm. There are other values and there are other systems, for example, functioning ecosystems, that we want to have continue to function even as the situation worsens. And if mitigation is having a detrimental effect on those systems, well, you have to look carefully at that particular mitigation project.
Yeah, and if I may, you know, grasping from your scientific background, what is your take on the really ever-growing technological progress we are seeing? For example, do you have an idea about nuclear fusion or geoengineering or that kind of stuff? No, this is an honest question.
To introduce a light note for a moment.
Yeah.
I'm a fan of the San Francisco football team, and 2 years ago, we in the college draft, where you take the best players from college and you bring them into the National Football League, we drafted a quarterback, Trey Lance, who had only played, I think, 2 years in college. But he, on paper, he looks like an amazing player. He can run, he can throw, he's got a giant arm, and he's still only started, I think, maybe 3 games. He's been hurt twice. And in those games he had all the physical skills, but it's not at all clear that he was going to actually be what it takes to be an NFL quarterback. To be an NFL quarterback, it takes a special something. And I kind of, and it's possible to imagine that they will forever have him on the team, and it's forever going to be the great hope. Isn't that going to be amazing when he really lives up to his physical potential? And that's the feeling I have about fusion. It's like every 10 years I read a long story about the latest fusion technology, the big project, wherever it is in Switzerland, France, somewhere up in the Alps, right? And it's always, we're so close. And wouldn't this be amazing if it worked? We're so close. And then it's like you've put however many billions of euros into it. It turns out that these connectors outside the toroidal magnetic field, they get really hot and they melt. So you have to have a fix for that. And it's like every time you just about got it. So I can't help worrying that we will never quite get there.
I disagree.
And because people have been trying really hard and putting hundreds of billions of euros into trying to make it work, and it's almost, we got a net positive bit of electricity for a few milliseconds out of this reactor. Hooray! Great.
No. I know the story. The problem is that there is a difference in say we have not reached the target, and we are saying that we have been reaching the target 50 years ago, and every year is 50 years later. This can be a vision. But as a matter of fact, in the last, say, 20 years, we did progress in this respect. And believe it or not, a nuclear fusion plus hydrogen produced using energy and water will be the future. Not for me, not for you, also because you are 1 year older than me. So not for me, not for you, for our grandchildren. There is no other possibility. So nuclear fusion, I don't know when, say 100 years time, can be the solution, must be the solution. I don't know when, of course, I don't have a clue.
And here's the problem. We tend naturally to imagine that the world of the present will evolve, but in some way resemble 50 years from now, we will still have something kind of resembling the world we live in. But the nuclear fusion project is a good example. I believe some critical components are made in Japan. It's a multi-country consortium that have been working on this huge project. And just step back and think about what that implies. It means you have a wealthy, that is well-financed system of international cooperation with stable member states contributing contributing big chunks of money from their national budget. And yes, I can see that world in which energy is hydrogen-based, whether as fusion or as combustion. I can see that. But can we really imagine in an ever more destabilizing climatic situation that these structures of international cooperation and structures of national cohesion are going to be robust enough to actually produce that kind of paradise of free, no carbon energy? I'm a little worried.
Yeah, I see, because as I said before, generally speaking, in the way you propose your subject, it's as if in a distribution of outcome, including this one, you tend to be sit in the tail of the distribution, which is the least favorable hypothesis may come. I'm just saying, I would like just to say in the middle. I'm more, also because I don't see the reason why. Oh, I mean, it's a matter of opinion. I don't see why we should tend to see the worst. Of course, fusion is an issue in the sense, and you have described it perfectly. By the way, fusion is an issue, and the climatic system doesn't care if the emissions are from China or US. The importance is to reduce emission. So, taking your point, if fusion will be in India, will be only in, say, in US, Europe, Germany, it's good. It's not. It's a good point because there will be less CO2 emission. Doesn't it's not so relevant. The emission are less in China or India instead of US or Germany.
Two things. First, on the probability, the bell curve, the distribution of possible outcomes. I brought that into the conversation in an earlier New Yorker piece. When it was brought home to me that when you ask a scientist to make a confident prediction about something, if you're a public scientist, you're obliged to say something that you are quite sure is true. And what you can say is, what we're looking at is a probability curve with various outcomes in terms of global mean temperature in the year 2050. You ask a scientist, how bad is it going to be? And the scientist is not going to pick a number from the middle of the curve because, by definition, that's only 50% likely. In order to make a confident prediction, they have to themselves go to the extreme low end of the curve, which is an outlier position, in order to make sure that 90% of the area is to one side. So I actually think that we are living in a rhetorical space, an activist space, where those confident predictions are treated as if they're the most likely outcome, when they're not actually. So I don't think I'm way out on the far disaster fringe. I'm just trying to reorient us toward the center of the probability distribution. So that's one thing. And I think perhaps at a deeper level, where we are differing has to do with the fact that you live in a world of science, and I live in a world of the humanities. And as somebody who lives in the world of humanities, I'm most interested in people. And my view of people is that they can be very good, but they can be very bad. And the book that changed my way of thinking about the climate and that got me involved in writing about it was Dale Jamison's book. I don't know if you know it, Reason in a Dark Time. And his book has a pretty simple structure. It says, we are enlightened people. We are the children of the Enlightenment. We believe in science. The science was clear 30 years ago. If we don't stop pumping carbon in the atmosphere, the world's going to fall apart. Well, then rationally, let's try to solve this problem. And most of his book is taking point by point, from an ethical perspective, from an economic perspective, from a political perspective, why it is difficult to solve this particular problem. And the takeaway, Dale, who's something of a friend now, and who's been involved in climate conferences since Rio at least. He takes the more humanist position of, people are just not built to deal with this problem. And there you go. You can say, well, we can see it. We can see rationally what the thing to do is, but whether human beings collectively and even individually are capable of doing that rational thing is a very different question. And that's where my pessimism comes from.
Yeah, I personally, I think I have the feeling that I'm not far away from an idea of people. I do care about people. I mean, I think there is also a reason. I think there is also a reason to think about differences among science as say a non-scientist, because we are both sharing the same experience in this earth, and we both. I think I share the same concern you have about the future of the world and the future of the people of this world. Probably you are assuming that I have a more cynical approach to the story, which is not true. I don't think so.
Not at all, not at all. In fact, I think perhaps mine would be the more cynical. Not really cynical. I call it realistic, but every cynic calls their realism, their cynicism, realism.
I guess just to honor our time, I just propose just one question that quoting your page 19, because you propose a reverse version of a fair quotation from Kafka, there is no hope except for us. And you basically are considering in this respect two approaches to climate change. Keep on hoping that catastrophe is preventable, and feel as I feel, more frustrated every day and enraged by the war's inaction, or, as you said, accept the disaster, that the disaster is coming, and then rethinking what it means to have hope. So the problem is it possible to be optimistic without having hopes?
Well, I will say here that even though I did get into the science and the politics and the activism of the climate question in that little essay, it really is an essay about what it means to have hope. And I was speaking not as an activist. I was trying to speak to the individual reader who feels that there could be more honesty on both sides of the subject of climate in the public space. Obviously, the climate change deniers need a whole lot more honesty, but also perhaps the climate activists could use a little more honesty. And if you don't actually face what I consider the facts, then you have this hope tinged with this anxiety that the hope is based on something that is simply not true. And that we are creatures of hope. We have things we're looking forward to, things we want, things that we could make better by working on them, things to enjoy. I'm looking forward to my beer tonight. And to be optimistic, is hope and optimism, are they the same thing? I don't know. I don't think the Catholic believer who hopes to have eternal life in heaven after death would be called an optimist. I think that we're talking about an emotional factor here. It's based on things that are not hard fact.
Sorry, also because you add in a certain lines of your book something which is, in my view, is very nice. To some extent, I mean, if I may, also a romantic statement, which is, as long as you have something to love, you have something to hope for.
Yeah.
These are your words, not mine.
Well, yes, those are my words, and I think it's true. I was writing for the person who wakes up in the night with this dread of what the future is going to hold.
Yeah.
And of course, for all of us, the future holds death, and that I wake up thinking about that fact. Can hardly believe it. I'll be dead, and it won't be too long until I am dead. And now we have that prospective death writ a little bit larger. There is a possibility that the whole planet could basically become uninhabitable, and everything we love is going to die, even after we ourselves are individually dead. And and my point about love was, this shouldn't stop you from doing something. That even if we fail to arrest galloping climate change, there are still things to be done for the things we love.
We hope so.
And those actions usually partake of some kind of hope.
And I need just to thank you a lot for this very intriguing discussion. I feel richer than I was at the beginning of this discussion. Of course, you have an open invitation to this place, and we can discuss this time with a glass of wine. Let me add just a few information or few consideration for the people that was involved in this organization, and because as you know, organizing an event like this requires the cooperation of different persons, friends, colleagues. Ilenia, Marta provided first hints, and by the way, many creative thoughts, and the idea of organizing this meeting is from them. Eduardo, Edward, and Ilenia were beneficial from my perspective in reading material, gave me support in writing questions. Communication activities have been possible thanks to Chiara, Andrea, and Julia. Friends and colleagues from HubLab, Nicole, Alessandro, Valentina gave essential support, and apologies, really apologies for all the persons definitely I have forgot to mention. Jonathan, I really thank you. It was a pleasure and honor to meet you, and I hope to have the opportunity to see you in person sooner or later, here or elsewhere. Okay?
Thank you. I would love to get back to Italy as soon as I can. I never have not enjoyed being there, and it would be a pleasure to meet you too. And thanks again to everyone who's tuned in. Thank you.
Okay. Take care. Bye. Ciao.
Bye-bye. Ciao.
Chiudete voi. Arrivo, non vi muovete.